gentlemen, welcome to Toward a Quality of Life. We're here on a very cold evening in the month of January, the year 2004. I heard a lot of people saying when New Year's came that 2003 was not a good year for them, and they're hoping for better things in this year. And maybe, since I never seemed to flow with the tide, 2003 seemed neither here nor there for me. It wasn't too bad. But anyway, this evening I have invited Mr. Seth Donlin, who is associate editor of a Boston-based newspaper, which has a lot of politics in it. The paper is The Weekly Dig, and I've noticed that he often talks about things that are political, and he is especially interested recently in matters about the court's role in our society, activism versus non-activism, or making sure that things don't change very much according to principles laid down long ago, the role of the Constitution, and the role just of where, as a country, we can go, should go, and are at the present moment. So I'd like to welcome Seth to the show.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Let's start by talking way back when. You can tell us the years, like how this country of ours started, technically speaking, in terms of the Constitution and maybe the Declaration of Independence, kind of what's in that basic Constitution. So how it goes from Declaration of Independence to Constitution to the Bill of Rights, and is that part of the Constitution? And then what kind of a framework does that provide?
Well, okay. When the founding fathers, as we call them, got together and wrote the Declaration of Independence, they of course were, still colonists of, still citizens of England, colonists of America, and they declared their independence from the Crown of England. And at that time, there was really very little governmental structure. They each considered themselves the citizens of their individual states, and the first real American government was a treaty between the 13 colonies that were becoming the 13 states. They all looked at themselves as their own separate nations, essentially. And the first, collective government was something along the lines of a NATO. They didn't have a universal leader. They didn't have a universal governing body. They had come together as a league. And after the success of the Revolutionary War, and they realized that they wanted to become more unified, that they wanted to become one nation, they sat down and had the Constitutional Convention, and they drew up the Constitution, which basically laid down the framework of how the federal government of the United States would work, what powers were reserved to the federal government, and to what branches, the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative branches, and what powers were reserved to the states, and what powers that no government should have, what powers would rest in the individual, and that no government should be.
So at that time, the 13 colonies were effectively the states?
Correct.
And the idea of the judicial, executive, and legislative, did they have a model for that? How did they figure out the three?
Well, they were, most, I think, it's probably safe to say, though I'm certainly not the expert on this, but most European nations were operating under this basic type of rule that you had in Europe for a long time: the monarchy, the courts, and we'll leave the religious courts out because often there were religious courts as well. But as far as the civil power went, you had the monarchy, the courts, and a legislative body. And the founding fathers based the government upon that, but they said we're not going to have a hereditary executive branch, and we're not going to have a legislative body that's partially hereditary, like the House of Lords at the time, and still is to a certain extent in England. We're going to have a be purely elected and appointed by other, elected officials. But they weren't. They just didn't make it up, pick a number 3, and go with it. I mean, it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure they had some inspiration for it from somewhere, and in fact, even a model, a basis on it for doing it. Tell us a little bit about, broadly speaking, and it is broad in and of itself, broadly speaking, what's in the Constitution. And too bad, because we want to cover so many things tonight, but it would be nice to know what inspired some of the kind of things that go into the Constitution, what was in people's minds and in the atmosphere of the time that made the kind of verbiage that is in the Constitution. But broadly, what's in there? What kind of...
Well, again, they lay out, much of it is laying out the basic framework of how the government is going to work, and much of it is checks and balances. So you have that the executive branch is going to be in charge of the military, in charge of basically foreign affairs, the rights to negotiate treaties, things like that are going to rest with the executive branch. In a way, that only makes sense. You can't have, if we're going to negotiate a treaty between your country and my country, we can't have 200 people from both sides trying to negotiate. You have 2 people. You might have a team, of assistants with them, but it's more efficient if 2 people can negotiate it. Say that sounds great. Now I'm going to go back to my country with it and make sure it sounds, it's good with them. And so foreign affairs were largely relegated to the executive branch. You had the legislative branch, which was what the Founding Fathers saw as being closest to the people, and therefore they wanted the laws to be made by them. Of course, they just fought a war over the fact that the King of England and the Parliament in England weren't paying attention to them, weren't paying attention to their wants, weren't paying attention to their needs. So it was very important to them that the laws that were being made, taxes that were being passed, that a decision on whether to go to war or not was going to rest with that body that was closest to the people themselves. And so that ended up being in the legislative branch.
Did you say whether the country goes to war?
Yes.
Did you say that? Did you say, because we're not going to do it now, but we have that whole so-called concept of preemptive war. But anyway,
yeah,
Congress
sure.
is supposed to be the arbiter of whether we go to war or not. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay.
And then you have the judicial branch, and obviously you need to have your laws that you've created faithfully carried out, and you need to have people that are accused of crimes be tried by an fair and impartial judge and jury. And there's a need for a judicial branch, and the judicial branch is made independent from all those other branches, so that there can be no or little political pressure put on a judge as possible, so that as little corruption is going to happen as possible. If a judge doesn't have to go back to the voters to renew his or her judgeship, then that judge is not going to be likely to try to pass, to judge in a way that, decide cases in a way that the people are going to like. If they're not beholden to the executive branch or to the legislative branch, they're not going to judge. They're not going to rule in cases in a way that is going to make the executive branch or the legislative branch happy. They're going to do it, hopefully, in a way that the law should dictate. And of course, the Founding Fathers didn't want any one particular branch of government to have too much power. It was one thing that they were very paranoid about, because they felt that had been a problem in England, and so they tried to divide the power up as much as possible, that if some crazy person got to become president, they couldn't really do too much damage. If the Congress was taken over by a group of real radicals, they couldn't do too much damage, because the judicial branch and the executive branch would be keeping them in check.
Surely they had radicals on the right in mind when they thought of that.
Well,
right? Is that what you meant
right,
by Congress?
Could be.
Could be. Now, there's a couple of things, as you say that. One is, at the time, were thinking their needs were not met by the King of England and England as the power over them. Today, you hear very much from both the left and so-called right people are not being heard. The Congress is on bought and sold, signed, sealed, and delivered,
right,
and not close to the people. You hear that no matter what the opinions are politically. You hear that kind of comment very
right,
much on a show like C-SPAN has or something like that.
Sure, sure. I think that it's. I think that that's a problem that's probably built into any democratic system. Maybe not. There's always room for improvement, and we have the right to amend our Constitution if we come up with better ways of doing things, and certainly if we do come up with better ways, we should. But I think that one problem is that as we've become a more and more sophisticated country, a country of greater and greater number of people with a much more complicated economy, you want politicians, people tend to like to vote for politicians that they think have some kind of, whether it be academic or whether it be commercial or whether it be some other type of political experience that they think, well, this person is going to do a good job as my representative or as my senator. I don't want somebody that has absolutely no experience because these people are doing important jobs and I don't want them to screw up. The problem is that when you get somebody that's an experienced politician or you get somebody that's an experienced business person, then they're that much further removed from your average, and who really is an average American, but you get somebody that's that much further removed from an average American. And so the more time that a politician spends with the people, the less time that they're maneuvering in Congress, maneuvering in Washington, and potentially being outflanked by their opponents. But the more time they spend in Washington playing the political game, the less likely they are to really know what the people are wanting and needing. So you kind of have this, you know what I mean? There's a pull from both sides, and I think a really good politician has to find that middle ground, and it's probably pretty hard to find.
Yeah, well, it's true in a computerized and, as you said, sophisticated society, technological society. You have to have skills, and we're kind of in a two-class society is what's really going on. Those with skills and opportunities therefrom, and those without some of the many kinds of skills along certain spectrums. But we're kind of dividing into people who have what it takes to be employed, and quite fruitfully so, and people who are struggling and don't have that kind of background. But be that as it may, and be that, of course, that in a complex society, a technological one, you need the skilled person, a modern one. I think that the fact that the way politicians are elected and can maintain being politicians has to do, the fact that it has to do with the money contributed, and that the contributors, of course, are corporate. I mean, this is a song that's been sung over and over again, that is really the most important reason why the politicians are not close to the people or not working for the people, or that people complain about it.
Absolutely. I think that campaign finance is incredibly important right now. We need to find a way to take big corporate money out of politics as much as possible. I think that another real positive step could be, and sometimes I go back and admittedly go back and forth on this one, but I think that some strict term limits could be very important. I think that limiting our president to only 2 terms is a wise move, and I think that probably senators should be limited to 2 terms, and representatives should be limited to 4 maybe, or something like that, or maybe 6. So the most that they could spend was 8 or 12 years in there, because I think we can pick people that we trust can do a good job, and in 8 or 10 or 12 years they can make an impact, and then they can move on and let the next group of people with fresh ideas come in and make an impact. But when people stay for a long time, that's when they begin to owe favors. That's when they begin to really cast votes to just trying to stay in office.
They can move on to be lobbyists who then control the Congress.
Right.
But the paradox about that is that the longer you stay, the more you know. It takes 8 or 10 years to be skillful, to get effective in the Congress itself. And if you have people that are short-lived and corporations continue to govern the financial control of the situation and therefore control of the situation, they can always just place lackeys in there.
Sure.
If you're not going to have people who have to really learn how to do it.
Well, that's why I think it's very important to get that corporate money out of there. If you
that's
got the
key.
corporate money out of there, then
it ain't going to happen.
Then you would be a lot safer in having term limits. But I think that when you think about the amount of money that politicians make, and they make a considerable amount of money. I mean,
not to live in Washington, though. If you're talking to Congress in Washington, they don't make all that much. I'm not favorable to raising their
oh, sure, but they make
income,
something.
But
they make
it costs
something
a lot
like
of money to live in that city. So.
Well, it costs more to live in Boston.
Not if you're, but you have to. No, I don't think so. Not to be a congressional person and have the kind of apartment they're supposed to have. And I don't.
Now, see, I disagree with you on that one because what kind of apartment are they supposed to have? They don't have to have a nice apartment.
But they do. They have to have a certain standard. And
well, but they don't have to.
It's a very expensive place on that basis.
No,
very expensive.
No.
They have to probably have chauffeured cars.
But they get that paid for.
They get the chauffeuring paid for.
They get their travel paid for.
But what about the vehicle itself?
Oh, they drive government vehicles.
Oh, they do? Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, I didn't know
Congress
that.
people have government vehicles. They have a lot of their expenses, just like if a corporate officer is on business, then they're for instance, if you're CEO of Nike or whatever, CEO of X company, of XYZ company, and you travel out to California on business, well, the company picks up your travel expenses, your lodging expenses, picks up your food expenses because you wouldn't have had to eat in a restaurant if you'd been home. You would be able to eat at home. So anytime a congressperson is away on, is traveling, like you are the you're the senator from Kansas. Now you're in Washington. That's where your home is because you're doing. That's where you have to be to do your job as a senator. But then when you have to fly out because you're on the defense committee and you have to fly out to Oregon to check up defense plan or something.
Oh, I know that.
They cover all of that. They have a car, they have secret, not all of them all the time, but they have Secret Service protection then they have to have special drivers to make sure that nobody can, get to a senator or a representative.
Nobody except the corporations. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, no, but they have to, most of them are well-suited, literally.
Sure.
And, they have a certain, restaurants that they go to that aren't paid for. They have a certain circuit parties they attend. There's an awful lot of expense to be a conventional kind of congressperson today. Is it Bernie Saunders? Is that his name from Vermont? Is it? He's a very populist, Naderish kind of guy, and he's not probably doing most of those things. He's a socialist guy. Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, and I think that's true. I mean, they're traveling in very fine circles,
elite circles.
But
yeah, but I mean, so the income is kind of paltry. I mean, they're dealing with people who have incomes.
Are making millions. Agreed. But they're also living a very nice lifestyle. And when you think about it, there are people that have. Let's take President Clinton, for example. President Clinton was a career politician. Is a career politician. Well, he's still getting paid. I mean, as a president, you're still getting paid. But if at any point along his career track he had not made the next step, if when he was governor of Arkansas he had not been elected president of the United States, it's not like he had been a successful businessman or, even though he had a law degree, a successful lawyer. And he could say, no problem, I'm just going to go into law practice now, go back to my law practice that I was making $2 million a year before at, and just keep making $2 million. Some politicians have that to fall back on. But there are many politicians that are career politicians. In their 20s, they are a staffer for somebody. In their 30s, they become a city councilor. Then and they move on up the tier. And if they lose their job as representative or senator, nobody's lining up to pay them. Now, some lobbyists, they will get a job as a lobbyist. But my point is that their skill set is only in politics. So they fight to hold that job, even though it may only be $150,000, and that might not be huge money. It's still the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to. They don't want to go back to making. They don't want to go back to being the editor of the city desk at the Des Moines Tribune or something.
Is it $150,000?
I think it's somewhere in that neighborhood.
I thought it was $135,000, but they did give themselves a raise, though. I don't quite follow.
But it's somewhere in the. It's somewhere in the. Certainly 125 to 175. I mean, the president makes $2 something. I think.
No, it's 400.
Is it 400 now?
And ironically, the poor boy from Arkansas, he made the 200, and it was at the end of his term that the law went into effect. I think passed.
Right.
Under his
that they would get more.
Penning that it doubled to $400,000 to the rich boy from Texas.
Right.
We have the poor boy from Arkansas and the rich boy from Texas.
And of course, he's collecting that money. I haven't heard any.
That he's
JFK didn't take any pay his whole time in office because he said, I already have enough money. I don't need the, which is a nice gesture, but.
Okay. Well, speaking of the Clintons. Not that we are. You mentioned President Clinton. The other odd thing about that family and himself for rising as far as he did to the ultimate position is how little they did have in terms of money along the way. Given what peers had, and they were kind of faulted for it as being sort of trashy people, that they never had a house to live in or something.
Well, it opened him to the attack of that he was doing things to build himself a nest egg for when he got out of office. Wealthy politicians will always make that argument that, I made myself millions as a business person. I don't need to kiss up to big business because when I'm done with my political career, I'll go back to making millions. That politician over there is poor, and so that politician has to take bribes from big business, and I don't believe that's true. I think they all.
I don't think that was leveled at him too much. I think they begrudged that he could make big money giving speeches once he wasn't president. He didn't make the $1 million that Ronald Reagan made in Japan on a speech, but $1 million or $2 million for one speech. But and then they tried to boycott. They wouldn't. They boycotted letting him speak at many places in the beginning and so on. But my first question when a wealthy politician, I won't name names, somebody close to home, is in office and they have very, very much money. We're in the state of Massachusetts. My first question is, why would you want that office if you have all that money? That's a big question I think should be on people's minds. Why would people who do have so much money want to go to a job that often you really have to wonder if done well is no fun and games, is quite dreary. For example, a governorship is quite a tedious grind done properly for very low pay, different from what one might be used to. So it's very interesting. Dick Cheney, why would he want to? I just saw recently he may leave in the next term. I don't know. There's talk about that. But why would someone of that financial stature be attracted to? So the Constitution, I just have to ask that. Thank you. Excuse me. So the Constitution as a basic framework, the three branches, and I'm reminded too when you talk about the three branches that currently the president and his entourage are trying to make the presidency more powerful than it has been, at least in recent history.
That's correct. That's correct. He was trying to bring a lot more power into the executive branch and gather a lot more executive privilege to himself. And that, depending on what he uses those powers for, you could say that's a good thing or a bad thing. But it certainly is a change from how things have been in the past, and one that bears very close watching, because you don't want to unbalance that three-way system of checks and balances. You don't want to get one of those three being overly powerful.
What if they're all corrupt simultaneously? What if they're all bought and paid for? What if there are pressures on the judiciary? What if they're aligned? What if they're, networked and part of coteries which have agendas that, fall in line with a consolidation of control, shall we say?
If that's the case, then we're in very grave trouble. I don't think that that's necessarily the case, though. I think that certainly bringing up, like you mentioned, what if the judiciary is being pressured or is co-opted, or certainly judges are not any different than than anybody else, in that they have their political beliefs and they're going to carry them into office. So, any judge is supposed to be impartial in terms of the law, but the judge's job is often to interpret the law, and they're going to interpret the law based upon their core beliefs. And if they are, what today we call conservative, they're going to hand down conservative rulings. And if they're what we call liberal, they're going to hand down liberal rulings. I like to think that not all three branches are corrupt at this point, or at any one time have been. But
or that not so much corrupt, but listening to, like I said before, listening to the skilled set of society rather than the relatively unskilled set of society, shall we say?
Well, I think that gets back to another problem in our modern society, is that, and in society in general, people respect authorities on a subject. And if you have a politician that really doesn't know anything, as most people don't, about energy regulation or something, okay, well, you're a lawyer, a trial lawyer from Ohio, and you get elected to the House of Representatives, and what do you really know about energy regulation? You don't. That's not the type of law that you practice. And now you find yourself voting on energy regulation. Well, who do you go to have school you on energy regulation? Do you talk to a history professor, or do you talk to a doctor, or do you talk to somebody that works in the energy industry? Well, hopefully you go to somebody that works in the energy industry, and then hopefully you go to some nonprofit groups that are watchdog groups for the energy industry and try to get both sides of the story. But you definitely want to go to the people that are involved in that industry. If you didn't, I would say you're being negligent. You should take what they say to you with a heavy grain of salt, but you need to go to the experts. And I think that I think that our society tends to put a lot of emphasis on what the experts say, and I think that a lot of times it's not necessarily that politicians are as bought and paid for as we say. I think that a lot of times they're just gullible. They listen to what the so-called experts tell them, and they believe it and move forward, because they have another vote tomorrow, and another vote the next day, and another vote the day after that.
Well, I disagree with you there, because you will even hear politicians weary of the fact that they are perpetually on a treadmill to make money every day of every hour of every second.
Oh, sure.
That's what's the main thing that's involved in being of a political office, is you're always having to make money. The clock is running constantly. So they have to pay attention to getting their money as a primary goal. And so when you talk about energy, yes, you do have to know people from the industry, but they're the ones with the money. You also have to know people who may also be experts, but but may not be industry experts, and yet they're experts on not alternative energies, but alternatives to thinking only about energy.
Sure.
You know, to thinking that you have to have energy and that you have to find ways. You have to have all kinds of so-called experts.
Right. You need to listen to both sides and make an informed decision.
Many sides, and also communities who are getting a bit dispossessed because a lot of information is being closed now, which was available under the Freedom of Information Act for people to know, let's say, in terms of energies that are going to be affecting them, especially at the local levels and the larger levels. Many of those kinds of information are no longer available, and the right of communities to have information that affects them directly and so on is being denied, and as a conscious effort currently.
It's very true. We have a very there's a lot of fixation with secrecy right now in our society, in our country, and 9/11 only reinforced that. This administration that's in the White House right now is very, very much in love with secrecy and believes that the president should, and that their decisions should be being made behind closed doors because better decisions can be being made behind closed doors, and there are always some decisions that should be made behind closed doors. Obviously, when certain things in the intelligence community, you don't want to publish that. Our spy Jane Doe and the such and such told us this, but then there are certain things that should be secret, and then most of the things shouldn't. And he and his administration are trying to sweep into the category of should be secret many things that shouldn't.
And as far as spy information goes, I think sometimes there have been things told about spies and captures that should never be told.
Sure.
On the other hand, you wonder, why are they blabbing?
Right.
If this is really true information, why would they be repeating it in broadcast? Makes no sense. Of a certain, person thereafter, people they've captured, what they've told them, what methods they've used. Why would that be being drilled home as public information? That makes no sense at all. The Constitution as a framework, then, is it sort of it is a careful document that no one authority, one branch has most power, but is it also crafted so that the people and what the people need, that means everybody, all people, all citizens get the maximum benefit, that laws apply to everyone across the board, and that people are afforded to live similarly no matter who they are, that all people are to be taken into account, hopefully.
Yes. I mean, it's crafted in that way through some of the amendments, through the Bill of Rights, but it's also crafted in that way in that the Constitution is a relatively short document. It's not a big, heavy tome like you might see, and it's not the tax code. It's not even a high school chemistry textbook. It's 6-8 pieces of paper that you could print out on your computer, and the Bill of Rights is another page, and all the rest of the amendments are maybe 2 more pages. It's not heavy reading. It's not exciting reading, but it's not heavy reading.
Yeah.
And at the end of the Constitution, they basically says any rights not held by anything that is not that the federal government is not empowered to deal with are reserved to the states. Because our founding fathers were very states' rights, they still looked at themselves as really kind of 13 separate countries that were all deciding, kind of like the European Union, that, okay, we'll become one larger group. And there was a lot of push and pull as to how much power the federal government would have, how much power would be held with the states, because they had different cultures and different laws, and they didn't want to give up the way that they were doing things because it was done a different way in another state. And furthermore, the Constitution says that any laws that aren't reserved specifically to the states, and anything that the state constitution doesn't say. If the federal constitution says that the federal government can't regulate it, then it falls to the states to deal with. And if the states don't say that it's something that they should deal with, then it falls to the individual to deal with. And so there are many, many things that initially, and over time, more and more laws have been made, and there were amendments and judicial interpretation of certain laws have changed things. But there are still a lot of things that our government doesn't tell us how we should do it, or that we should do this,
such
or
as,
another
for
thing.
example?
Such as, I guess, religion is one of the ones that it's easiest to think of, and one of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, says that Congress can't pass any laws regarding religion, or how it should be followed or how it should not be followed, and that's something that's reserved to the individual. There are a number of other things like that. It doesn't, though the Constitution doesn't specifically touch on them, and that's the point. That's what they're saying, is that anything that we don't specifically touch on is up to you as an individual to deal with. Marriage is one of them. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about that you can or can't marry, or what age you have to be to marry, or what, how many times you can get married, or how you should dress, or
what language you have to speak,
what you should eat, who your friends should be, when you should, what days you should work versus you shouldn't work, what time you have to go to bed.
Well, we have states' laws on the Sunday rule.
Sure, and that's the federal government, and then the states have individual laws, and those change, those come and those go, just as some federal laws come and go.
So there's a lot of areas that the state and or the federal government cannot tell you what to do.
That's correct. There's a lot of areas that they can't tell you what to do, or that they've chosen not to tell you what to do. There's not many things that the Constitution tells you that you can or can't do. They leave that up to the Congress was empowered to pass laws, and the Congress can pass a law saying you can't work on a Thursday, or you have to work on a Thursday, and now the courts might rule that to be constitutional or not constitutional. I'm certainly no constitutional law expert, so I couldn't say whether they would find it constitutional or not. I would think that they wouldn't, but that's a law that Congress could pass. It might be struck down, but they haven't chosen to pass that law.
Or they can't do something like has been done in certain communist countries, saying you have to be in this kind of school program. This is what you will study. This is the profession you will be. They can't do that. So that in this country, no matter what your aptitude is, you in theory have any possibility.
Right.
In other words, we'll even engineer you to the nth degree to get you through something that may not be best suited for you.
Right. There are certain the only real job limitations, it seems to me, placed in the Constitution are really political ones. They say, you can't be president until you're 35. You can't be you have
to be native born.
You have to be native born, though you don't have to be native born to be a senator or a representative. And so, there are some limitations placed on those, and, those may or may not be good. I'm certainly not really bucking for a 32-year-old president, so I'm not terribly worried that I can't be president of the United States at this point. I guess if I want to, I'll just have to wait a few more years. But
right.
It's not on my agenda right now, so I'm not feeling terribly oppressed by that law keeping me from being president.
Now, so the Constitution is about 6 pages or so of normal print, not too exciting to read, laying out the 3 branches of government, the rules of who will have what authorities, what falls to the states, what is in the hands of the federal. Also giving some information on sort of rights of people, rights and responsibilities of people. But the famous part of the document, which you tell me came how many years after, like 5 or 6 years after the Constitution itself?
That's correct.
The famous part is the so-called Bill of Rights. And those are amendments, and there are, how many, 25 amendments to the Constitution?
Now there are, 30
or more?
I can't remember. There's
quite
30,
a few.
36,
quite
32,
a few.
36, something like that.
So there's several amendments. There's the Constitution itself, and then
Some of you will probably call me out on that, and it turns
that's
out that
okay,
there's
as long
lesser
as you
amount,
just
but-
give a range. That there are, and then after the Constitution itself, certain amendments.
Right. The last amendment was passed in '96, I think. Surprisingly,
What was
it was an amendment that said that any pay raise Congress gives itself can't go into effect until there's been another election. So Congress can't vote themselves an immediate pay raise and say, all right, well, tomorrow our salaries go up to $1 million
Except
or
that
whatever.
they're signed, sealed, and delivered, and they'll be there the next time.
Exactly.
Okay, so the famous part of these that we hear about so much, of these amendments, is the Bill of Rights, which is Amendments 1 through 10.
Right.
And that's where the famous one is that you were talking about, that the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, meaning with respect to an establishment of religion, and or abridging the freedom of speech.
Right. Or of the press.
Or of the press. So you should be able to say exactly what you want at the weekly dig, and no one should bother you about it. Is that correct?
In theory, I mean, there are certain things. Obviously, I can't publish something that says that you are a mass murderer or something without the proof that, in fact, you are.
Oh, if it's libel.
Right,
yeah.
if it's a libel.
But, yeah.
Or if it is essentially just, as long as it's not libelous, we can write whatever we want.
Yeah. How about if you came out with an opinion that you think, for example, pedophilia is fine? Is that allowed?
Yep. That's
allowed.
I mean, it's not. We're not purporting that that's fact. That as long as it's opinion, you can say whatever. I could say, in my opinion, you are. If I said, in my opinion, you're a mass murderer or something, that might be getting close to libel, because then you'd be saying, well,
libel.
Why is that your opinion? And I say, well, I've heard or something, but as long as you're not
But that's done all the
something
time,
up.
especially in politics.
Sure.
There's little innuendos put out
Right.
there precisely to besmirch people's reputations.
Right.
Yeah. They did a pretty good job on Clark recently, but he's coming out of that. They really, downed him there for a while, saying he was a pretty lousy guy. A lot of stuff started getting into the media, and now you don't see that so much. So
and if something that you are writing is obviously satirical, that covers you as well. At the Weekly Dig, we recently published a piece under the name of John Kerry.
Oh, really?
And we said a bunch of what was obviously, it was pretty over the top. It was obviously, it was recent. It was right after he had been quoted swearing in Rolling Stone magazine, and in some other instance he had sweared, and seemed to be a calculated move to try to make him look cool and hip.
Yeah, the leather jacket. Yeah.
So we wrote an article purported to be from Senator Kerry, where he was swearing up a storm.
Cursing. I heard somebody corrected me. Cursing is the word. Yeah.
Okay, cursing up a storm.
Yeah.
And we actually got a phone call from his campaign. We got an email at first, and then a phone call from his campaign threatening suit unless we wrote an apology and took it down off of our website and all of that kind of stuff. And we went back and forth with this person that called from his campaign for a while, and we said, well, did you really think that do you think that anybody was fooled into believing that your candidate actually wrote these words? And the person said, well, no, obviously nobody would think that. And we said, well, there you go. I mean, it was obviously a joke. Mm-hmm. We still wrote a retraction just because, we don't need to get sued by Kerry's campaign, but it was quite obviously a joke, and our retraction was
tongue-in-cheek
quite
as well.
tongue-in-cheek, and we even took a jab at the person that called us up and kind of accused them of being mirthless and being overly
having
concerned
their hair
and,
put in place just
exactly.
so.
And so you can have a lot of fun with that too. So.
Yeah. Let's see. Amendment 4, the right of people to be secure in their persons. No unreasonable searches or seizures. And except on probable cause.
Right.
Nothing about their private life, to be invaded.
Right.
Except with probable cause.
Right.
And
it's very interesting that you use the term private, nothing in their private lives. In private obviously leads to privacy, and this is where people will say that there is a right to privacy. But there are a number of people that will claim that we as Americans have no right to privacy, and when you say, well, of course we have a right to privacy, they will say, nowhere in the Constitution or in any of the amendments does it say that you have a right to privacy. Point out to me where it says you have a right to privacy, and you can say, well, in Amendment 4 it says, and then they say, yes, but that says search and seizure, that's not privacy, and you can go back and forth. And so a lot of the Constitution is obviously open to interpretation, and that's the job of judges.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us to that point you had mentioned to me on an earlier conversation, the literalistic view of it.
Right.
And I can see where in this case, if it's sort of like what people do with the Bible. You read passages from the Bible and you take them literally.
The world is only 3,000 years old or whatever if you read the Bible literally.
And many things, people wonder about. They may think the sea really parted, whereas other people can show you that there may have been events that could have sort of metaphorically been a parting of the sea over time, and so forth and so on, to the idea of even looser metaphor that the Bible is intended to convey.
Right. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but right now there is there's somewhat of a controversy in the national parks. That at the Grand Canyon they're selling a book that there's a guide, there's a long-time guide in the Grand Canyon that is a quite religious man and is a fundamentalist in his interpretation. He's a creationist and a fundamentalist in his interpretation. He believes that the Grand Canyon is only 3,000 or 4,000 years old, that the Grand Canyon was a result of Noah's flood. And there's this book that they're selling in the gift shops around the Grand Canyon that espouses this belief that the Grand Canyon is only 3,000 or 4,000 years old, rather than 1,000,000 or however old conventional science interprets the Grand Canyon to be. And it's kind of a humorous controversy to a lot of people, because you think, come on, how do you have this? How can you be selling a book in a national park?
Yeah.
That is purporting to tell people that the Grand Canyon is only 3,000 years old.
Sort of like a miraculous event rather than
the erosion of water
event.
Over time.
From what we know of how things happen.
Right.
By history. Yeah.
And if you believe the Bible literally, then I guess you have to believe that the Grand Canyon is only a few thousand years old. But I think that most people, though many people will argue with me, I guess, but certainly if you live on the East Coast in a major city, you don't meet too many people going about your average life that, even if they're very devout Christians, that would argue with you that the Grand Canyon isn't hundreds of thousands or 1.5 million or old. And that would say, well, no, it was created by Noah's flood.
Noah's flood was only 3,000 or 4,000 years ago?
That's my understanding.
Really? I thought it was... Oh, Noah. So the Old Testament is only 1,000 or 2,000 years before Christ.
I think so.
We're talking Constitution here now. We're not in the Bible.
Right. I'm no Bible expert.
You're not a biblical scholar.
But you had the Jews escaping from Egypt. Noah leading them out of Egypt, and the height of the Egyptian culture that they're talking about. That was, only 1,000 or 2,000 years before the height of the Roman culture, and the height of the Roman culture was like 150 A.D. or something like that. So you really don't you're really not talking about too much long time,
no,
4,000 or 5,000 years at the most, or something like that.
Yeah.
So, well, that's
even before that, right?
Before that.
I love Babylonia. Well, I like what God said to Noah, according to Bill Cosby.
What's that?
You've not heard that spiel?
I love Bill Cosby, but it's not
early Bill Cosby, and I just saw a rerun of it the other day, but where he's Noah's going about his business, and he suddenly hears a voice, Noah, and he's being told to make an ark. What's an ark? Yeah, so yeah, very cute. Yeah. All right. Well, there's a lot. We barely scratched the surface, as usual. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments. There are many amendments that follow thereafter, somewhere between 25 to 36 or in that vicinity. Two famous amendments, besides, of course, freedom of speech, no establishing of religion, the right to be private, or shouldn't use the word privacy. Some people might disagree with that. But to not be searched or insecured, so to speak, without probable cause. And the two very famous ones, 13th Amendment, not part of the Bill of Rights, that came later in time, right. 1865, the abolition of slavery. 1865, the 13th Amendment, that no one shall be a slave, a one-sentence statement that I'm only paraphrasing. And the 19th Amendment, that came in 1919 and was ratified in 1920, that women shall vote. It doesn't say that, but that sex shall not be a determinant of who can vote. Therefore, women, beasts of burden be that ye is, shall be able to vote, if ye can learn how to scribble some little sign onto a piece of paper.
That's right. Make your mark.
So that's about it. The basic parts of the Constitution, like we've said a couple of times, aren't that exciting to read, but it sure is important to be thinking about who your government is, how it's operating, for the bigger question, how we are living together as people, which is the age-old question that will continue forever, and it's of primary importance to every human being. How we live together, a constantly evolving situation.
Absolutely. And the more we know about the basics, like we've been talking about tonight, the more we can make informed decisions, I think, about the problems of today.
And the onus is on all of us to be better informed. We say it all the time.
Sure.
But it shouldn't be a nasty thing. We should know as much about this as we do about the Patriots. Go Patriots!
That's right.
All right. Seth Donlin, Associate Editor of the Weekly Dig, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Thanks for having me on here.
You're welcome. And you're becoming a bit of a scholar about the early years, the Constitution.
Well, it seems that way. That's one of the great things about my job, is that I constantly get to learn something new, I learn, they say you should learn something new every day, but as a journalist, that's really what you get to do. You get to go out there and study something. You have to write an article about something. You have to learn the history of it. You have to know, all the different angles of it so you can write about it effectively, and that's probably the best thing about the job.
Great. Well, if that's the kind of job you have, if you're writing articles about who wore what, I guess...
Well, right. Well, then you have to know the history of fashion, I guess.
No, not really. Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. And we'll say good night to you and see you again very soon. Adios.